Welcome to SCDM's AI and eSource podcast series. My name is Linda King, and I'm the SCDM facilitator for the eSource Implementation Consortium. The consortium's mission is to advance the adoption of eSource in clinical research. The use of artificial intelligence in its many forms, whether generative AI, agentic AI, machine learning, natural language processing, large language models, or GPT, has a potential to increase eSource adoption through the most effective implementation processes, documentation, training, validation, etc. This podcast series will talk with folks using AI and eSource from multiple clinical research perspectives, sites, sponsors, and technology vendors. Our guest today is Dan Braga. Dan is representing the technology vendor perspective. Dan leads Medidata's trial management and clinical data interoperability solutions. Dan comes to Medidata as part of an acquisition of IntelliMage, a company that he co-founded that managed clinical data for the clinical research and healthcare industries. Prior to that, Dan held various leadership roles with organizations such as GE Healthcare, WebMD, and more, with a focus on healthcare data collaboration solutions. Welcome, Dan.
Hey, thank you very much. Really appreciate you having me. Excited to have this conversation today.
We're happy to have you. Thank you. A quick SCDM disclaimer before we get started. This podcast is provided by the Society for Clinical Data Management, SCDM, eSource Implementation Consortium. It is intended for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal, regulatory, or professional advice. SCDM and the speakers are not responsible for any actions taken based on the information provided. Users are advised to consult with appropriate professionals for specific advice tailored to their individual circumstances. The opinions expressed are attributed to the speakers only and not their respective employers. Let's get started. Dan, before we dive into AI, could you start by sharing what area of eSource you focus on the most? For example, ECOA, EHR to EDC integrations, digital health technology, digital protocols, monitoring, end-to-end data flow, eSource training analysis, or others?
Yeah, great question, and really kind of level sets the rest of the conversation. I think, from a Medidata perspective, honestly, all of it. eSource to us isn't a module. It's really the connective tissue, that connective foundation for the trial. We, as an organization, have been leaders in the collection of data from the source, for years. You mentioned a few of them, but EDC, kind of the foundational, part of our platform, ECOA, sensors, and other digital health initiatives. Newer to our kind of eSource mix is EHR to EDC. How can we connect directly to EHR solutions, medical record solutions at healthcare organizations to get to the data and bring it onto our platform. But also, how can we connect to other eSource providers that are out there? We're very ecosystem focused. So again, we kind of get involved in all of it, but I think if it helps to anchor this conversation, we can use EHR to EDC as an example that we kind of weave throughout the rest of this discussion. I think it's a good one where you see scale, you see workflow friction, and real operational pain, and we don't really optimize isolated steps there. We're designing systems. We're designing, back to what I said earlier, that kind of connective, kind of tissue for that. A lot of people are, focused on these point solutions. We really think in terms of connected ecosystems, because if the data flows cleanly across the life cycle of a trial, everything else gets easier. Startup gets easier, execution gets easier, monitoring, quality control, and more. So it's we really think that's where the scale shows up.
That's a great breadth of eSource experience. I think that end-to-end data flow that you mentioned is really critical in being successful, and that's what we found in the eSource Implementation Consortium, is that understanding all parties is really important. As a technology vendor perspective, maybe we can dive a little bit deeper. Can you share what kind of eSource projects involving AI that you're currently working on or have worked on recently? And if you can, what type of AI tech is being used, like generative or agentic AI, for example?
Yeah, we're big believers in a few key areas within that. I'll talk a little bit about virtual companions. AI. Think of that AI that kind of guides you, through a process. Sometimes a simple process that's just really mundane and just something that somebody has to do over and over again. Where AI is great at helping to automate that, keeping the human in the loop. But oftentimes it's also virtual companions to guide you through complex processes as well. Processes that tend to be error prone and where there's common mistakes that are made throughout, and AI virtual companions sitting at your side can really help to eliminate that. And we'll touch a little bit on generative AI. Probably not as much of a focus for the examples we use today, but kind of where that value ultimately, kind of accelerates, the generation and the creation of, documents and, other, data throughout the platform. But I think overall, we're very deliberate in what we do. We believe that you shouldn't have to, I mentioned this earlier, you shouldn't have to go use AI. That's not the goal. Hey, let me leave what I'm doing to go log into an AI application to do this. It sounds cool. It's the buzzword. You shouldn't really need a separate AI application at all, for that matter. And you shouldn't feel like you're toggling into a chatbot to get something done and then coming back to, where you were working. AI should be embedded directly in the workflow, right where the friction, exists the most, right where the pain points exist the most, and ultimately where we can deliver, the most impact. We're doing AI for impact, not just doing AI to do AI. I feel like, a lot of what we see and why we've been, again, back to being deliberate, why we've been very deliberate is a lot of what we see is AI, being stapled onto existing products. Those, kind of press release worthy feature announcements about AI this, AI that. We wanted to really avoid that, square peg being pounded into a round hole, type use cases. So again, it's that AI for impact. If it doesn't reduce friction, if it doesn't increase speed, at scale, if it doesn't improve quality, or really like materially change the outcome, then to us it's just noise. We're not interested in the noise. We're interested in really doing those impactful things. So again, back to the eSource examples, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this as we move forward. But like within EHR to EDC, there's specific areas where AI can add a ton of value, and that's really what we're focused on, not the AI just to have the AI label on what you're doing.
It makes a lot of sense. It's a very complicated space, moving data or transforming data or collecting data. So it makes sense to have it just working in the background. You mentioned, all these different types of situations where AI could be helpful. How long have you been using AI in eSource work, and is your approach evolved over time?
Yeah, for sure. We have been, in the eSource space for a long time. Um, Again, we're rooted kind of in our EDC history and now expanding into lots of other areas, but really all around that, getting to the source of data and really automating that collection of data in the most streamlined and efficient and powerful manner we can. So that foundation has always been there. How we've evolved, though, is really our discipline around embedding AI in that. Early on, just like everyone, there was a lot of experimentation. Where can AI add the most value? Predictive models, pattern recognition, a lot of interesting demos and a lot of interesting experimentation, as I mentioned earlier. But over time, we really asked that harder question: Is this truly operational? Does this work at scale across, not tens to 20s of studies, but thousands upon thousands of studies? I think most importantly, is this something that our customers will rely on? And when I say our customers, the sponsors and the CROs that we serve, the sites that we serve that are ultimately using a lot of these solutions, and ultimately the patients that we're ultimately, all partnered on delivering value to. So is this something that people are going to actually rely on, not just think it sounds cool because it has, AI on that? So again, we see a lot of AI right now that looks very promising. It's area anything that we can do to automate collection of data, ensure that the data is of the highest quality, decrease those, kind of moments in a clinical trial where you're finding out about something too late. So there's the right time and the right place to surface an error that was detected, surface an anomaly that was found, surface an outlier that was detected, and so on. So that's, from an eSource perspective, we're very focused on that. But then we're also very focused on just operational challenges. A lot of, with EHR to EDC especially, there's a lot of mapping of data. What exists in an EHR doesn't always directly align with what your EDC or how your EDC is configured. So the AI, there's huge opportunities for AI to help with, hey, I see this in your medical record system, and I think it goes here. I see this in your EHR. I think that this is the right spot, for it to go in the EDC. And we'll talk about human in the loop and more about that later. But that's really that. How our approach has evolved, starting with the collection of something, and now really looking at that. We've got a good historical perspective on the pain points of, the collecting of data over, 25 plus years of doing that in the industry. But now where can AI very tactfully, very strategically, be plugged in to provide the most impact in those processes? So it's constantly evolving, as you can imagine. We're just really scratching the surface. We feel like we've got or we're far ahead of the what we're seeing in the industry. We're trying to think far ahead as well. We're not just being reactive to what we're seeing today. We're trying to be ahead of the curve in terms of what we're bringing to the industry. But overall, we think we're as an industry just still scratching the surface in terms of the things that we can do and how much we've evolved.
Yeah, it's really exciting to think about how it has changed. As someone who's been in the industry a very long time, I'm excited to see some opportunities to improve, like you said, the patient experience, as well as site and others in the clinical research space. So that's a lot of good work going into that. And wondering if we could get a little more specific. Could you share one or two examples or case studies where AI was applied in an eSource project, and what were the key challenges and what ultimately worked well?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today, we'll maybe zoom in on EHR to EDC. I think just a great example of a really exciting eSource initiative, but also one where just moving forward, AI continues and will continue to evolve and add a ton of value to, ultimately to the sites that are, feeling some of the pain the most, but also the sponsors that are feeling a lot of the pain in terms of how monitoring is done, how verifying the data that was collected is appropriate and accurate, and so on. So if I zoom in on that, EHR to EDC space, one of the hardest problems or biggest pain points, I should say, in this area is mapping. I kind of touched on it earlier. How do I, blood pressure in the EHR and blood pressure in the EDC form might be called different things, and how do you, kind of move data from the left to the right and ensure that it, goes in the right spot. So historically, what we've seen, that's heavy on the configuration side. long setup cycles, a lot of manual mapping exercises. And for a new technology, like EHR to EDC in our industry, that's and the excitement around EHR to EDC is as big as anything I've really ever seen, and the promise for it as well. But when you introduce a new technology like that, you don't want to slow it down with a lot of manual, implementation and a lot of manual, kind of quote unquote getting started, processes. So we applied AI to really power that, assisted data mapping, for lack of a better term, processes. We AI is really good at understanding the structure of EHR data on one side, and then really intelligently proposing mappings to where it should go on the other side, dramatically reducing the configuration burden. So we at all, at every time where we can, we like to just avoid having to do the mapping altogether, leverage AI. Always have a human in the loop to verify. We're big. You're going to hear me talk a lot about that. We're not here to, replace them. We're here to make the individuals that are performing these tasks better. We're here to make them more efficient, let them have more time to do the things that matter rather than, data entry or mapping data every single time they want to do it, and kind of going through all these configuration steps and setup processes. So but again, it's not magic. It's really contextual learning at scale, as a good way to look at it. So from the eSource perspective, the data is acquired, it's mapped, it's inserted into the EDC, it's confirmed by a human, and all of that I just described, AI is in touching in a very impactful way. So we could also touch on, just one quick note. I know I said we wanted to zoom on EHR to EDC, but you mentioned at the start of this, digital protocols, or what we as an organization refer to as a virtual twin of a protocol. We're big in that, the virtual twin, space, whether that's of protocols, of clinical trials, virtual twins of patients, virtual twins of sites, to really optimize, trial design, really plan operationally, especially plan your trial before the trial, even starts. So from a use case and a case study perspective, there's a lot that we can explore in that area as well. And that's really just starting to evolve in our industry today, how you could take a digital representation, a virtual twin of a protocol, and all the different things that you can do, there. So some of the out of the gate use cases that we're really seeing there and seeing a lot of value being delivered to our customers is around protocol optimization. And again, we have these virtual twins of thousands upon thousands of protocols, but we also have the historical data in terms of how trials have performed. So why not use AI to provide insights up front to users as they're designing their protocol? Hey, based on what we're seeing in your protocol, comparing this to the thousands of virtual twins we have, as well as how those trials ultimately performed, we think you should tweak this. You have too many visits here. You're asking for too much data to be collected there. By doing this, you're going to be out of budget. If you reduce this, you might get the same, data and reduce your spend in certain areas. There's so much value that we can deliver that we think that's really powerful. We think that's really impactful. But coming back to EHR, it's a perfect example of AI and eSource, and we're really just getting started. Lots more to come from that area.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, as you mentioned a few times, the phrase "human in the loop," which is really near and dear to our hearts in the eSource Implementation Consortium. We talk about that quite a bit. If you think about, some of the main risks maybe that you've identified using AI and eSource, and how are those risks being mitigated? You mentioned a human in the loop. Are there other risks or mitigation strategies in the use of AI that you're considering?
No, I think you and I both have hit the nail right on the head with that one. With the biggest risk, especially in AI as it relates to eSource, is being wrong. If you're if you're fully automating moving data from the left to the right, or kind of over from one system to another, and it's not that maybe it doesn't, some things don't become fully automated, but the biggest risk is just simply being wrong. And as we all know in clinical research, you don't get to be mostly right. So that's why we're really unwavering about a human in the loop. AI should help to acquire the data, as I mentioned earlier, help to map the data, and maybe even fully automate that process. But AI should also identify issues, flag anomalies, all with a human in the loop. Flag it for somebody else to to verify, to correct if an error was made, to really kind of manage the correction of that the issue that was identified. So it's all about that human in the loop, leveraging the human to validate and what AI actually discovered. AI isn't perfect. It's not everything that it flags, every anomaly that it detects, every issue that it identifies doesn't mean that it actually is that. But flag it, queue it up for somebody else to look at quickly, give them as much context. That's another area that AI does a really good job at, is bringing a lot of different things together so that the human in the loop process can be much more efficient. And again, it all comes back to, we want especially clinicians and healthcare providers, we want them to have more time doing the things that matter, and that's not all of these manual steps that we just described. So the goal isn't to replace people; it's to make them dramatically more efficient and higher quality. We think there's a dangerous, kind of narrative out there about AI eliminating roles and in these regulated environments, and I don't know, that to me is unrealistic, and perhaps even irresponsible. I think it should really amplify somebody's expertise, not bypass their expertise. That's really what it's all about. So, and that's how you build trust too. We try to be very transparent in our approach to AI. I always labeling where it's being used, how it's being used, what kind of AI is being used. In this space, trust is everything, in the clinical research space. So we got to be, very intentional about, the transparency that we provide into how we're using AI.
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned talking about AI not being infallible, and but also it can be used as a way to facilitate a process. Um, Data cleaning, quality assurance processes. It sounds like that's part of the opportunity that Medidata sees with that. Um, how effective do you think that AI has been so far in being used in data cleaning or quality assurance processes?
Yeah, I think this is one of the um, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of the clearest, most mature use cases really of AI. AI is exceptional at detecting outliers, anomalies, inconsistent patterns, and throughout your data that really just doesn't make sense. Some of this, when you, so that's the what AI does, but what's more important to us is, where does that get plugged in? Some of this happens in real time. Some of it happens downstream in the process, as well. But the point is that you catch it before it matters. You catch it before it delays, hurts, and has a negative impact, on your trial. You're going to hear me talk so much more about that. AI for impact. AI for impact. We want to, just make sure we're adding value, and that can be at different points in the process, different stages of the workflow. So again, detecting an error, very important. How you surface that, when who you surface that to, is even more important. So, like, speaking for Medidata, when you've supported thousands and thousands of trials, and you train AI on that historical data set that you have, AI is good at recognizing kind of what normal looks like, quote unquote, whether that's in oncology, cardiology, rare disease, and or whatever it is. But ultimately, recognize what normal looks like, and then flag what's off. And again, just flag it, human in the loop, bring it back to somebody, the right place, right time to, to make sense of it all. This isn't, theoretical for us. This is really production level, quality management, stuff that we have a long history in doing, and just provided a ton of value to the to the industry.
Yeah, it's definitely, like you said, evolved over time, and where we are here and now is an exciting place as well. A lot of interest at all the conferences and such to really maximize the use of AI. I thought maybe we would turn a bit and kind of finish out our podcast today, looking ahead. So, what changes in the future do you foresee in scaling AI across eSource, whether it's tech or could be governance or even workforce readiness to use it?
Yeah. You used the word scaling AI, and I'll touch on that. Scaling AI, very important point here. I think scaling AI is not about adding more features. It's like feature, check, check, check. That is not scaling AI. It's about embedding that intelligence where it matters the most. That's what we are just like uberly focused on. Where can we embed intelligence, embed AI to where it's going to deliver the most impact for our users. And again, our users could be the sponsors, the CROs, the sites, and the patients. So we want to really focus on automating the right steps. So from an agentic AI perspective, where do people get hung up? We're really looking at, manual processes where people get hung up on certain things. Where can a, kind of virtual companion be plugged in to really, help to move things forward faster in a more reliable way, in a cleaner way, reduce errors, along the way as well. Where can we surface insights before issues become problems? We just, previously talked about, error detection and anomaly detection and so on. So we're really focused on doing that and continuing to do that. We have a long history of that. But how do we surface those, things that were detected or found in the right place at the right time? We're really focused on connecting workflows as well across, design and planning. How can we ensure that trials are designed and planned in the right way, and then ultimately started, kind of get the trial started and executed in the right way. In Medidata, we call that the study experience. It's kind of bridging that gap between, kind of design and planning and startup and execution, all rooted in a layer of simulation. Again, we've got great AI, but we also have great data and historical, views into to clinical trials, and those two worlds coming together allow us to, ensure that trials are designed the right way out of the gate. It doesn't matter how good of a execution tool you have, an eSource tool you have, whether that's your EDC, your CTMS, your ECOA, EHR to EDC. We can go on and on and on. None of that matters if the trial was designed poorly out of the gate. It's we believe that a great anything, any of those tools plugged in, is only great if it's part of a bigger experience. So we're kind of bringing those worlds together. And again, AI is front and center in all of that. And then finally, I just kind of leave with, anticipating, obstacles before users hit them. It's something we're really, big on. If we think blank's going to happen because of a decision that was made earlier, let's let them know about that. Give them the opportunity to correct it. It's very expensive to correct mistakes mid-trial. It's much less expensive to correct mistakes as soon as you can, earlier in that kind of design and planning. So again, AI, we're really, really big on AI powering all that. And ultimately, I'll just leave you with, we want transparency. We want users should know that AI is part of the system. Users shouldn't think of AI as being the system, but they should know that it's there, whether front and center from a virtual companion perspective or behind the scenes, doing error detection and some of the other examples we mentioned earlier. We just want to, users should know about that. They just shouldn't have to think about it. No extra logins. We think a lot about that. No extra dashboard to check in on. No separate workflow. just thoughtful embedding of the AI, throughout the process. The future really isn't AI everywhere. It's really intelligence and AI woven into the fabric of the system, at scale, kind of grounded then in the decades and years upon years of data, that we've collected over the years. So again, I'll just kind of close out. The difference really is less AI theater and just more AI for impact.
It makes a lot of sense. It's been great speaking to you today. You painted a great picture on the opportunities within eSource to facilitate and the collection or the review of the data. So it's a really good opportunities, like I said, ahead of us in the future, and it's very exciting. Um, well, thank you so much for your time today, Dan, and sharing your AI and eSource journey.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity for these types of conversations.
You're very welcome. And thanks again. For the audience, please join us on Spotify for additional podcast episodes on AI and eSource. And thanks for listening.